Okay, welcome to part three of culture. And I want to start off talking about hearths of popular culture. Now, I'm using it in the context of popular culture, but it really could be any type of culture. But what a hearth is really the place of origin. It is where a cultural trait started. So if we're talking about a particular language or a particular fashion style, where did it come from? Where did it begin? So, in reference to popular culture, we would most likely think of large urban areas. Because, as we mentioned earlier, a characteristic of popular culture is it being of an urban nature. So, we would most likely think of places like New York or LA or Tokyo or London as hearths of popular culture. If we want to go back to ancient hearths, then we would probably think of places like Mesopotamia or Mesoamerica or the Indus Valley, places where the very earliest cultural traits were born out of and diffused from. Now, generally, you have a cultural trait that begins somewhere, which is the hearth, and then it begins to diffuse. And it'll generally begin with contagious, what is called contagious diffusion. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in the next slide, but that is essentially diffusion that is diffused from person to person. So it generally begins with that type of diffusion. So if we want to talk about diffusion in a little more detail, there are a few terms that I want you to be familiar with. The first two have to do with different types of diffusion methods. Now, there are several, but I just want you to be familiar with these two, one we just talked about. Hierarchical diffusion is diffusion that begins in the largest areas, then goes to the medium-sized areas, and then the smaller areas. So another way of saying that is it diffuses from the largest cities first, then to the medium-sized cities, then to the smaller places. So it diffuses according to size of place in a hierarchical fashion. So, for example, if you are watching a movie trailer, and at the end of the movie trailer, it's a new movie, and it says, sneak peek this weekend in New York and LA, everywhere else the following week. So it's basically saying it's going to diffuse to these two large areas first, then it's going to diffuse to every place else, and then maybe you live in one of those towns where you pay $1 to see the movie and you get it a year and a half later. Okay, so it's diffusing according to hierarchy or size of place. Contagious is the other method that we just talked about, where it doesn't have to do so much with size of place, but that it goes from person to person. And this is probably easy to remember because when you think of contagious, most people think of illness and disease and sickness. So if you have a cold, for instance, you're not going to give your cold to someone across the United States that you've never had contact with, which would be a hierarchical fashion. You're going to give it to the person that you're in contact with, the person next to you. So a contagious style of diffusion is person to person. Now, there are two primary models, I guess you can call them, to discuss diffusion. And the classic model is what is called distance decay, and that's shown in the first diagram. This is a method in which in the center you have the hearth. And those rings around the hearth designate interaction and how much diffusion is going to occur. And it basically says the farther you move away from the hearth, the less interaction you're going to have, and therefore diffusion is going to decrease. So that's why it's called distance decay. The farther away you are, the diffusion begins to decay. So people that are really far away are less likely to have that cultural trait diffused to them. So that's the classic model. Time-space compression, which is shown underneath that, is a more updated version of that, which basically says at one point of time, distance decay may have been the standard way that diffusion occurred. However, today, with technology, communication technology, information technology, the internet, social media, all of those sorts of things, that distance doesn't play as big of a role in diffusion as it once did. So it may not mean that if someone is 3,000 miles away, that something isn't going to diffuse to them, because now they just need to see it on the internet. One tweet and it can be literally around the world in 60 seconds. So that the distance doesn't play as much of a role. I mean, at one point in time, many of you may have had the experience of having a pen pal where you actually wrote a letter, like with an actual pen, an actual piece of paper, and you wrote a letter to someone, in another country. And it may have taken months to get there, or weeks to get there. And then you wait and wait and wait, and then you finally get the envelope with the response. Well, now if you want to talk to someone in Norway, for instance, all you need to do is Google, I want to talk to someone in Norway, and there you go. Something will pop up, and you can Skype or whatever. So it's a very different type of diffusion. However, you have to have access to that technology in order for that to happen, which is why that diagram is kind of warped looking. Because if you don't have access to that technology, then your diffusion is going to be the standard model, which is distance decay. So some parts of the world have access to it, and some parts of the world don't. So it just depends, okay, on your level of development in that particular area. Now, another term that is discussed frequently with cultural studies is cultural landscapes. And cultural landscapes have to do with material culture, and they are essentially the visible imprint of human activity on the landscape. So it is the things that we put in the landscape that tell us a little bit about our culture. It's our imprint. So without even looking at people, without even seeing people, you can learn a little bit about that particular culture. Sometimes this is referred to as reading the landscape. So if you drove around Fresno, for instance, and there was no one here, you didn't see any people, but you just looked at things, could you make some statements about the culture? And the answer is sure. You would see things like schools and universities and places of worship, and you would see agriculture, and you would see ethnic restaurants, and you would see all sorts of things that would give you clues about the culture that is here. So we could drop you down in the middle of anywhere without any people, and you're just going to look at the landscape. And again, just like material culture, this could be something grand or something not as grand. I mean, I read a study one time looking at driveways and how the type of driveway you had was related to culture, or the social class of the person or the family that lived in that particular house. And you'll be learning a little bit more about social class next week. And the study ranged, I don't remember the whole hierarchy, but he made a hierarchy ranging from, parking on the lawn up to, grass or gravel driveway to a regular, concrete or asphalt driveway, to at the top was like the half moon semicircle driveway, and it ended with the 2-mile long winding driveway where you might have a gate at the end, or maybe it said lions or something like that, where the gate opens up and there's this winding driveway before you get to the house. And the author's point was that each one of those driveways made a statement. Okay, they were saying something with that particular type of driveway, consciously or unconsciously. It was making a statement. Now, you can also have the concept of placelessness. And placelessness really means that you don't have that concept of place, or that notion of place. Remember place being one of the 5 themes? We talked about place a lot. So what it's basically saying is there isn't anything in the landscape that gives it any sort of sense of place or any type of regional identity. So for example, if you look at that picture and I asked you where do you think that picture was taken? Now, that Arby's sign, that cowboy style sign, was popular all over at one point in time. So you might instinctively say it's in the West or something like that, but not necessarily. I don't even know where this picture is taken. It's a random picture. And that's the point. And unless you wanted to kind of zoom in to look at a license plate, you really don't have any sense of where that might be. It could be in Boston, it could be in Washington, it could be in Houston, it could be on Blackstone somewhere. There really isn't anything that screams a particular place. There's no regional identity. So there are some people that actually are for this sense of placelessness and having areas kind of devoid of a regional identity, so we become more and more alike. And then there are others that feel that we need to bring back more of a regional or cultural identity in our landscapes, whether it be an architectural style or a particular type of design and housing communities or whatever. Okay, that there needs to be more regional identity. So those are two opposing viewpoints. And the last thing I want to talk about is the notion of cultural imperialism. And cultural imperialism essentially says that the United States is purposely trying to spread American culture. And again, like many things we talk about in this class, it's a very controversial topic. These are some photos of some American iconic things, Coca-Cola, Marlboro cigarettes, McDonald's, that you can find in many, many, many places around the globe. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to go anywhere without finding a Coke somewhere. But cultural imperialism can be very tricky because usually that term is used in the context of politics because it implies forcefulness. So when we use it in the context of culture, we have to decide what is the process that is actually going on. So I want you to think about these questions. Do you think cultural imperialism exists? And if yes, in what ways? So do you think that the United States is purposely spreading culture? Or perhaps you might think no. And if no, do you think we're just witnessing the development of a global culture that just happens to be largely influenced by the US? This could be globalization. And there are two articles that I'd like you to read that express those two opposing viewpoints, where one says, yes, cultural imperialism is happening, and this is why. And the other is saying, no, that it's more a process of globalization. So again, this can be a tricky topic that can have many different viewpoints. There's also an article regarding Frito-Lay that I'd like you to read, and diffusing potato chips across the world and trying to gain a market share in China, a country where potato chips or even snacking may not necessarily be that popular. Now, some may take the viewpoint that the tactics used are unethical because they're trying to change culture, and others say that it is business. And if you have a population of 1.3 billion people that you're not trying to tap into from a corporate perspective, that wouldn't be a wise decision. And that if that particular country doesn't like the product, it'll fail in that country. And it's that simple. So that it comes down to business more than anything else. So those are the two viewpoints. So there are two different articles, and then there's one kind of working example of that in the Frito-Lay article. So I want you to take a look at those and think about this question and see where you fall. And you might fall somewhere in the middle. You might be able to understand both sides of it. Or you might think that it's wrong, but that it just is. And it's kind of a globalization process that we can't really stop. Or you might think that perhaps we do need to stop it in some way to preserve certain cultures. So I want you to take a look at those articles. Okay, so that wraps up our last PowerPoint on culture.